Welcome to Inside Authors with me, Trishno H. Our interview today is with a nuclear physicist. His name is Ron Townsend, and I was so excited to speak with him because I don't know any nuclear physicists. I don't know about you. Now, the interview was done on the phone, so it's not as crisp as it could be, but it's a great interview. Check it out. This is Trishno H, and today I have the pleasure of talking with a nuclear physicist. And he is the only nuclear physicist I know and have ever met in my entire life. His name is Ron Townsend, and he is the author of wonderful sci-fi and historical fiction books. Mr. Townsend, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Well, Mr. Townsend, thank you for taking time out of your day to talk with us and just give us a glimpse into your world. Tell me a little bit about how you got into becoming a nuclear physicist.
So, when I was in college, my uncle was involved with a underwater camera company, and my brother-in-laws were both engineers and physicists. And so I was studying science, thought I'd become an engineer, and I had to, of course, every engineer has to take physics courses, so I took the physics courses. Mm-hmm. And during taking those courses, I decided I'd rather be an okay physicist than a good engineer. So I switched my major to physics.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
And when I switched to the university, because I was at the junior college at the time, the main degree that they offered was low energy nuclear physics. So that's what I took. But I began working for the Navy part-time during that time at the Navy lab in San Diego. Mm-hmm. And that really was much more of my focus. So I did graduate with a nuclear degree, but my real focus at the time really was to become or get involved with oceanography.
Wow.
So
oceanography, that's not just looking to see if the Titanic is still on the bottom of the ocean, right? It's much more than that.
It's the study. Yeah, it's the study of, currents and, the whole weather of the oceans and so forth.
Oh, wow.
And I started that path after I graduated. I began taking master's degree classes, but unfortunately the Navy kept sending me out to sea. So I was going out on research trips, and I was never able to finish the classes. I'd always have to drop the class because I was going to have to go out on a sea trip. So at that point, I just kind of said, okay, I'm never going to make that. And I just continued with my work for the Navy.
But that gave you practical application, though, huh?
Oh, yes. I was working on some of the first mini computers of the time. And, I was working with underwater acoustics. I was working with some of the lead acoustics people in the world. And, we were studying, I was supporting people that were doing bio research, studying the fish and the sounds and everything. So, I mean, it was a very interesting work.
Wow. It says here in my notes that you designed a military system for the Navy?
Yes. So as my work progressed, eventually in about 2020, in the year 2019.
Okay.
Sorry. In 1990, in the 1990s, I took a job with Raytheon. They were going to start building the next generation self-defense system for aircraft carriers.
Oh, wow.
And I started working with the lead engineer on that program. And eventually, over the years, she moved up to becoming the lead engineer for the surface warfare, Navy surface warfare and she kept calling me back to Washington, D.C. Eventually, I changed jobs over to General Dynamics in Fairfax, Virginia. And at that point, she needed to design a new tracking system that would work across all surface ships for the Navy.
Wow.
And I ended up becoming the lead focal point for that. So I became the lead designer for that. And the key was that the system had to be, the software had to be able to connect to all the various sensor systems and weapon systems on board a variety of different ships, everything from carriers to cruisers to aircraft carriers to what they call LPDs. And it had to be the same software that did all of this. And the whole point was to track everything from satellites down to submarines. And be able to give real-time situational display information for that and be able to feed the weapon systems for protection. So that became my focal point up through about 2012.
Wow. So I got to ask the question, when you were a kid, I mean, was that what you thought you saw yourself doing? I mean, who did you want to be when you were a kid?
So I wanted to be Spock. I was intrigued at the time when I was a kid by Star Wars or Star Trek.
Yeah.
And I was kind of a nerd, admittedly. I was a mathematician.
Well, nerds rule.
Pretty good at mathematics.
Yeah.
What was that?
I said nerds rule.
True.
Yes.
So I became fairly focused upon the, logic and those types of things, which progressed throughout my life. So. But,
so how did that? When did you start writing these wonderful stories? Because I've read some of these stories and I've narrated for you, and they are just incredibly creative stories. When did you start doing that?
So that occurred in the mid, about 2008 time frame. I was traveling literally weekly. I would fly from San Diego on a Sunday morning, and return back to San Diego on a Saturday, and then fly back out on the following day. And I was working out of Washington, D.C. area, and my youngest daughter was into art and writing. She was trying to make up her mind which way to go. And one day I had to take a trip down to a Navy lab south of Washington, D.C., and it was in the fall. And as I was driving, I just saw the trees that were just, aflame with colors and everything along the sides of the road. And when I got back to the hotel that night, I wrote her a little email and kind of a flowery paragraph describing what I saw. At which point she said, "Dad, I know you don't have a hobby. You ought to take up writing." And that was the beginning.
Wow. So what was the first thing you wrote?
So the first thing I wrote was the first sci-fi book that I wrote, and it's called Watcher in the Fall Connections. It took me a number of years to write it, and the reason was because I was used to writing for engineering and scientific purposes, which is a different style altogether from typical books. And it took me probably 20 or 30 different drafts before I finally got a draft that sounded about right.
Right.
But it also there was a push. So at the time, I decided I wanted to write something that was not just shoot 'em up, space warfare type of thing. And I was watching a TV show about Brian Greene, who is something known as an M theorist. And the discussion got into how did the universe begin?
Okay.
And his discussion was about how using M theory, there are multiple different universes, and that they could interact, and if two of them collided, the friction of that collision could create a new universe, and that was probably how our universe began. And that was the key to kind of the central core of my sci-fi series, was the birth of a new universe.
So I got to ask you then, do you believe in aliens?
Oh, of course. They're there. Maybe very hard and distant and separated from us to find, but they're there.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. Just can't. There's too much going on out there for them not to exist.
So I know that in your work, fly free is mentioned a lot. Tell me about that.
So it came across because I wanted to create or find a symbol to kind of represent the work. And at the time, my daughter was taking my youngest daughter again was taking a graphics course, and the teacher asked her to build a set of tiles that were unique. So she built a set of tiles, and she painted Sanskrit symbols on them.
Okay.
And she was going to throw it away because the teacher wanted gravel and grass and other things. She didn't want the symbols. So she was going to throw them away, and I grabbed them, and I said, no, I want to keep these.
Okay.
And as I was looking at it, there was one symbol there that caught my attention and kind of drove my imagination. It is a Sanskrit symbol, which means it's ancient language out of India.
Yes.
And it really is a blending of two mathematical symbols. One is pi, and the other one is C. And those two have very unique places within science. And it drove my imagination about how could something like that come about and evolve to, the positions that they hold now within science.
Okay.
And that symbol became what I call fly free. So it was I made a small derivation to it, but the idea was, I used it as a symbol that was used in communications across the universe by the alien races.
Okay.
And the idea was that when people were first contacted, the symbol became presented to them, and along with spacecraft moving and craft moving throughout atmospheres and stuff, flying free throughout the universe. Right. So that was kind of where the symbol got connected in.
I know that I've seen I've seen pictures of paintings, and some of the paintings there were some paintings actually of Christ on the cross, and there were these flying vehicles were in the background of those paintings, and these paintings are hundreds of years old.
Yes.
And it just when you were talking about that, that just popped in my mind. That fly free, and they were kind of flying around. So let me ask you this: if you had a message to give to today's engineering or students, what would your message be?
I guess my message would be that imagination is the starting point. And, you can learn all the math, you can learn all the engineering techniques, you can learn the languages, the computer languages and so forth. But to really progress, you need to understand how to harness your imagination.
Yes.
And I've had to do that many, many times throughout my career. And you have to understand what the problem is, and then find a way to imagine a solution. From that imagination grows the act of a solution. And in my early years of working with the Navy, I was involved in underwater search, or I was involved in searches for underwater submarines.
Oh, wow.
For the Russian submarines.
Uh-huh.
I used to give my young kids coming in to work with me the book of Hunt for Red October, and told them, go read that, and you'll understand what we're doing.
Right.
But the primary question I always brought myself to was, how do you find a black hole in the water? Because that's what a submarine is. It's just a hole in the water. And there's many, many different ways that you can imagine and find techniques to understand how to find that. But it's, obviously it's very technically difficult, but they all start with the imagining how to do that.
Yes, the imagination. You're right about that. My dad used to always say that, what did he tell me? What the mind can perceive that I could achieve. And you are so right about the imagination, and I hope that that we encourage our children to use their imaginations. We wouldn't have Cartoon Network or any of that stuff without imagination. Yes, that's pretty good. So, which book would you have someone start to really get into the mind of Ron Townsend? Which book would you have them start with?
So, the first one, which is the Watcher in the Fall Connections, kind of lays the foundation for the series. Okay. There is a shorter book called Tales from Our Universe's Edge, which takes small tales that are kind of discussed briefly within the major book series, but they expand them out and give me a chance to write a little bit more detail about the storylines. Okay. So that's another one. What was interesting was I wrote a series of short stories tying to the sci-fi series, and one of them was about Da Vinci because he had a great imagination. Yeah. Obviously. Yeah. I mean, his, you read his books or you look at his drawings and you see he had a very, very vivid imagination. Yeah. He couldn't always build what he was imagining, but eventually most if not all of them came true. Yeah. So I wrote a short story about him imagining this and connecting it to the Watcher in the Fall series. That his brain basically received these images and he began to imagine what could be done. But later on, I actually saw the movie Da Vinci Code, and then I went back and read the book, and I suddenly realized that my short story really could be twisted and to a story about Da Vinci during the time or during his life being the head of the Freemasons, which is what Da Vinci Code kind of focuses on. Yeah. So I rewrote the whole thing to create the story Da Vinci Connections, and created a plot line for Da Vinci Connections, which you've narrated for me. Yes. Wonderful book. Then I later on I thought about it, and there's a big treasure that the Freemasons are or were supposed to hold. Right. And it came partly, the history says partly that treasure came from the Knights Templar, finding a treasure in Jerusalem. Yes. So I decided to write a prequel to Vinci Connections and trace the finding of the treasure and the hiding of the treasure and how it eventually got connected to the Freemasons. And that was pretty neat. It created a unique story there. And then, of course, had the Da Vinci Connections. But then I wanted to kind of round it out. And after thinking about the movie National Treasures, I suddenly realized there was a connection in what I was doing to both the Freemasons and the hiding of the treasure in the movie National Treasures. So I created a third book, which follows the path of the hiding of the treasures.
Yes.
And then also bringing it to the point where the beginning of the Da Vinci Code story begins. So I wanted to bring that plot line forward and show kind of the background history of how, the beginning of the movie Da Vinci Code began.
Right.
So that kind of connected up and finished the series for me.
It's interesting that you didn't do them linearly. They weren't, just, you started prequel. It's interesting how you wrote one thing and then that kind of seeded something else, and then you were able to go back and pick up. That's very interesting that you did it like that.
Right. My technique, if you want to call it that, is I create a universe of structure.
Yes.
What's the founding basis of the universe of structure? In the sci-fi series, I lay that out pretty well. It's that we live in a universe kind of dominated by what's known as M theory, and that's a multi-dimensional, up to 11 dimensions universe, and it's through those dimensions that communications can take place and a variety of other things can take place. In the case of Da Vinci, or the Da Vinci Connections and the other books that go with that, once I laid out the story of Da Vinci Connections, it really kind of began to kind of swirl around in my mind of, okay, well, how did that treasure get there? How did the treasure? It became a whole set of, how did that happen? And,
right.
And so I was able to build a structure for a story, or for actually two additional stories based upon that would allow everything to connect together. Of course, because they're historical fiction, I still had to match history. And so, for example, at the end of the Da Vinci Connections, there's a movement by Da Vinci to France. Well, in reality, he did go to France. To work for the King of France. And the Knights Templar study, there was, obviously stuff going on in Jerusalem. There was a destruction of the Knights. So I had to place all of those together with the right timelines to make everything connect up properly. So,
well, they made for great stories. Great reading. Mr. Townsend's books are available in audio form as well as digitized and paperback, and they are available at his website. What's your website?
It's called RonTownsendPresents.com.
Yes, so. RonTownsendPresents.com. Now, you're also giving away a great thing. The Da Vinci Connection is the focused reading on your podcast for, it looks like, the last 6 weeks or so.
Right. The idea is that, we break that up into shorter, 18, 20-minute sections and, let you hear the story. And there will be other stories that will follow along. And so it's a way of getting the information out. And it doesn't cost you anything for that.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like people need to go and sign up so that they can be plugged in and tune into the podcast and see what other things that you have. I know that you've got some great short stories on there, as well as a number of books that should be loved by all. Anything you want, any thoughts you want to leave with our listeners?
Well, I guess the key thought is always let your imagination flow.
Yeah.
Everything starts with imagination.
Yeah.
And it's very, very important that you let your imagination flow, and then you can build reality off your imagination as you need to.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Don't be afraid. I think people are maybe afraid to allow their imagination, or to allow their imaginations to flow. And yeah, maybe, some people maybe think negative stuff, but
Right.
It doesn't always have to be negative, but you should at least try and tap in, I think, to the imagination, because you're right. If you allow it to fly free, who knows where you'll wind up.
Exactly.
Right. Yeah. Well, I thank you, Mr. Townsend, for taking time out of your day to talk with us. Again, you can tune into Mr. Townsend's podcast, as well as visit his site. The information is in our description. I've put a link in the description at the bottom. And we'll talk to you again. Thank you, Mr. Townsend.
You're welcome. Thank you.
You've been listening to Inside Authors with our guest today, Ron Townsend, author of Da Vinci Connections. Please visit the link in the description below for a list of all of Ron Townsend's titles. He has a lot of sci-fi, historical fiction titles that will just ignite your imagination. Please visit the link in the description for a list of all of Ron Townsend's titles, as well as a free giveaway item for the first 25 people who subscribe to his mailing list. It is a fly-free imagination symbol, and the first 25 people who click that link and subscribe to his mailing list will receive that item. Again, this is Trish No H with Inside Authors, where we connect with today's popular authors and why they write such wonderful stories. Be sure and subscribe and not miss an episode. Until next time, this is Trish No H. Be good.